The discovery. Elliot Harper had always been a writer, but not the kind who made bestseller lists or won prestigious awards. She was the kind who scribbled in the margins of her notebooks during long commutes, who stayed up late typing away on her laptop, only to delete everything the next morning. Her stories were fragments, half-formed ideas that never quite came together. She had a day job as a copy editor for a small publishing house, which paid the bills but left her creatively unfulfilled. She often joked that she was a writer who didn't write, but the truth was, it hurt more than she cared to admit. One rainy afternoon, while shelving books in the dusty archives of the publishing house, Elliot stumbled upon something unusual. Tucked between a crumbling volume of Victorian poetry and a forgotten manuscript on botany was a book bound in deep green leather. It had no title, no author's name, just an intricate pattern of gold filigree on the cover that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. Curious, she pulled it from the shelf and opened it. The pages were blank. Elliot frowned, flipping through the book. Every page was pristine, untouched by ink or pencil. Yet, as she held it, she felt a strange warmth emanating from the pages, as if the book were alive. She shook her head, chalking it up to her overactive imagination, and was about to return it to the shelf when something caught her eye. Words were appearing on the first page. She blinked, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her. But no, the words were definitely there, forming line by line as if an invisible hand were writing them. Her heart raced as she read. Elliot Harper stood in the dimly lit archive, her fingers trembling as she held the book. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment her life would change forever. The book had chosen her, and there was no turning back. Elliot dropped the book as if it had burned her. It landed on the floor with a soft thud, the pages fluttering open. She stared at it, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This had to be a prank, some kind of elaborate joke. But who would go to such lengths? And how had they known she would find the book? Cautiously, she picked it up again. The words were still there, but more had appeared beneath them. Elliot's mind raced. Was this some kind of trick? A hallucination? She wanted to believe it was, but deep down, she knew the truth. The book was real, and it was writing her story. She slammed the book shut, her hands shaking. This was insane, impossible. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to leave it behind. Something about the book called to her, a siren song she couldn't ignore. She tucked it under her arm and hurried out of the archive, her mind a whirlwind of questions. That night, Elliot sat at her small kitchen table, the book lying in front of her like a sleeping beast. She had poured herself a glass of wine, hoping it would steady her nerves, but her hands still trembled as she reached for the book. She opened it again, half expecting the words to have vanished, but they were still there, waiting for her. She read the next passage. Elliot sat at her kitchen table, the book open before her. She was afraid but also curious. What would happen if she kept reading? Would the story change? Would she? Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a book. It was a mirror, reflecting her thoughts, her actions, her very existence. And it was writing her story in real time. Elliot turned the page and more words appeared. She knew she should stop. She should close the book, lock it away, forget it ever existed. But she couldn't. The book had a hold on her, a pull she couldn't resist. And so, she kept reading, even as the lines between fiction and reality began to blur. Elliot's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to stop, to close the book and never open it again. But she couldn't. It was as if the book had taken control of her, compelling her to keep reading. She turned the page again, and again, each time more words appearing, each time the story growing darker, more personal. By the time she reached the end of the chapter, she was sweating, her hands gripping the edges of the book so tightly her knuckles turned white. The final sentence read, Elliot didn't know it yet, but the book wasn't just writing her story. It was rewriting her life. And if she wasn't careful, she might not survive the next chapter. She closed the book with a trembling hand, her mind reeling. What had she gotten herself into? And more importantly, how could she get out? The unraveling, Elliot didn't sleep that night. The book sat on her kitchen table, its green cover gleaming faintly in the moonlight that filtered through her window. She couldn't bring herself to touch it again, but she couldn't look away either. It was as if the book had become the center of her world, a black hole pulling her in, inch by inch. By morning, she was exhausted, her mind a jumble of fear and curiosity. She called in sick to work, something she rarely did, and spent the day pacing her small apartment, trying to make sense of what had happened. The book was impossible, yet it was real. It had written about her thoughts, her actions, as if it knew her better than she knew herself. And the final warning, she might not survive the next chapter, haunted her. By midday, she couldn't resist any longer. She sat down at the table and opened the book again. The words were still there, but new ones had appeared beneath them. Elliot spent the morning in a haze, torn between fear and fascination. She knew she should destroy the book, burn it, tear it to pieces, but she couldn't. The book was a part of her now, and she needed to know where the story would lead. Her stomach churned. It was right, she did need to know. She turned the page and more words appeared. As the hours passed, Elliot's curiosity grew stronger. She told herself she was in control, that she could stop anytime she wanted. But deep down, she knew the truth. The book was in control, and she was merely a character in its story. Elliot's hands trembled as she read. The book was right again. She did feel like a character, as if her life were no longer her own. She turned the page, and the story continued. That afternoon, Elliot decided to test the book. She would do something unexpected, something the book couldn't possibly predict. She would prove that she was still in control. Elliot's breath caught. This was her chance. She could break free from the book's hold, show that it wasn't all-powerful. She stood up, her mind racing. What could she do that the book wouldn't see coming? She glanced around her apartment, her eyes landing on her keys. She would go for a drive somewhere random, somewhere the book couldn't possibly know. She grabbed her keys and headed for the door, the book still open on the table. As she stepped outside, a cold wind swept through the hallway, making her shiver. She ignored it and hurried to her car, her heart pounding with a strange mix of defiance and fear. She drove aimlessly, turning down unfamiliar streets, taking random turns. She didn't know where she was going, and that was the point. The book couldn't predict this, couldn't control her. After about an hour, she pulled into a small park on the outskirts of the city. It was quiet, almost deserted, with only a few people walking their dogs or sitting on benches. Elliot parked her car and got out, taking a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. She felt a small sense of victory. She had done something unpredictable. She had taken back control. But as she walked through the park, her sense of triumph began to fade. The park felt familiar, though she was sure she had never been here before. The trees, the path, the distant sound of a fountain. It all felt like something out of a dream. She shook her head, trying to clear the feeling, but it only grew stronger. And then she saw it. On a bench ahead of her, a man sat reading a book. It was the same green leather, the same gold filigree. Her heart stopped. Couldn't be. She approached slowly, her legs feeling like lead. As she got closer, she saw that the man was reading from the same book she had left on her kitchen table. But that was impossible. The book was at home, wasn't it? The man looked up, and Elliot froze. His eyes were empty, hollow, as if he weren't really there. He smiled, a cold, lifeless smile, and held out the book to her. "It's your turn," he said, his voice echoing strangely. Elliot stumbled backward, her heart racing. She turned and ran, not looking back, not stopping until she reached her car. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unlock the door. She got in and drove away, her mind a whirlwind of panic and confusion. When she got home, she rushed to the kitchen table. The book was still there, exactly where she had left it. She opened it, her hands trembling, and new words had appeared. Elliot thought she could outsmart the book, but she was wrong. The book was always one step ahead, weaving her story even as she tried to escape it. And now it was time for the next chapter. Elliot's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She turned the page and more words appeared. Elliot didn't know it yet, but the man in the park was just the beginning. The book was rewriting her reality, and there was no escape. The only question was, how far would it go? She slammed the book shut, her mind reeling. This was beyond anything she could have imagined. The book wasn't just writing her story, it was changing her world, and she had no idea how to stop it. The descent. Elliot spent the next few days in a state of paralysis. The book sat on her kitchen table, untouched, but its presence loomed over her like a storm cloud. She couldn't bring herself to open it again, but she couldn't get rid of it either. Every time she thought about throwing it away or burning it, a cold fear gripped her chest, as if the book itself were warning her not to try. She tried to go about her life as normal, but it was impossible. The book had infected her thoughts, her dreams, her very sense of reality. She found herself second-guessing every decision, every action, wondering if it was truly her choice or if the book was pulling the strings. She stopped going to work, stopped answering calls from friends and family. She became a prisoner in her own home, a shadow of the person she used to be. One night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she heard a sound from the kitchen, a soft rustling like pages turning. Her heart leapt into her throat. She told herself it was nothing, just the wind or her imagination, but she couldn't ignore it. She got up and crept to the kitchen, her bare feet cold against the floor. The book was open on the table, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze. But there was no wind. The windows were closed, the air still. Elliot approached slowly, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. She looked down at the book, and new words had appeared. Elliot stood in the dark kitchen, her heart pounding as she stared at the book. She knew she shouldn't read it, but she couldn't help herself. The book was calling to her, and she had no choice but to answer. Her stomach churned. It was right. She did feel compelled to read it, as if some unseen force were guiding her hand. She sat down at the table and began to read. Elliot's life was unraveling. She had stopped going to work, stopped seeing her friends. She was consumed by the book, by the fear of what it might do next. But the book wasn't finished with her. Not yet. Elliot's hands shook as she turned the page. The story continued. That night, Elliot had a dream. She was standing in a vast, empty library, the shelves stretching endlessly in every direction. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and dust. She walked through the aisles, her footsteps echoing in the silence, until she came to a door. It was small and unassuming, but she knew it was important. She opened it and stepped inside. As Elliot read, she felt a strange sensation, as if the words were pulling her into the story. Her vision blurred, and suddenly, she wasn't in her kitchen anymore. She was in the library from the book, standing in front of the small, unassuming door. Her heart raced as she reached for the handle and turned it. The door opened to a room filled with mirrors. They lined the walls, the ceiling, even the floor, reflecting her image endlessly. But something was wrong. The reflections weren't quite right. Some were older, some younger, some distorted in ways that made her stomach turn. And then she saw it, a reflection that wasn't her at all. It was the man from the park, his hollow eyes staring back at her. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The mirrors began to crack, the reflections shattering into pieces. The man stepped out of the mirror, his cold smile sending a chill down her spine. "You can't escape," he said, his voice echoing in the small room. "The book owns you now." Elliot woke up screaming, her sheets tangled around her, her body drenched in sweat. She looked around her bedroom, her heart pounding, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she was truly awake or still trapped in the dream. She got up and went to the kitchen, her legs shaky, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The book was still on the table, open to the page she had been reading. She sat down and read the next passage. Elliot woke from the dream, her heart racing, her mind filled with fear. She knew the book was getting stronger, that it was seeping into her reality. but she didn't know how to stop it. The only way out was to keep reading, to see where the story would lead. Elliot's hands trembled as she turned the page. The story continued. The next morning, Elliot received a package in the mail. It was a small, unmarked box, but she knew what was inside. She opened it and found a key, old and tarnished, with a note that read, "The next chapter awaits." As if on cue, there was a knock at her door. Elliot froze, her heart pounding. She didn't want to answer it, but she knew she had to. She got up and went to the door, her legs feeling like lead. She opened it, and there was no one there. Just a small, unmarked box on her doorstep. She picked it up with trembling hands and brought it inside. She opened it and found the key, just as the book had described. It was cold and heavy in her hand, and she felt a deep sense of dread as she held it. The book had written this. It had predicted the package, the key, everything. And now it was leading her to the next chapter. Elliot sat down at the table and read the next passage. Elliot knew she had no choice. The book was in control now, and the only way to survive was to follow its story. She took the key and left her apartment, not knowing where she was going, but knowing she had to go. Elliot's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She didn't want to do this. She didn't want to follow the book story. But she knew she had no choice. The book had her in its grip, and there was no escape. She took the key and left her apartment, her mind a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew the book would guide her. The labyrinth. Elliot stepped out into the cold morning air, the key clutched tightly in her hand. The streets were quiet, the city still waking up, but she felt as though the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for her to make her next move. The book had written this moment, and now she was living it. She had no idea where she was going, but she knew the book would guide her. She walked aimlessly at first, her mind racing, her heart pounding. The key felt heavy in her hand, as if it were pulling her in a specific direction. She tried to resist, to turn down a different street, but every time she did, a strange force seemed to push her back on course. It was as if the book had mapped out her path, and she had no choice but to follow it. After about an hour, she found herself standing in front of an old, abandoned building on the edge of the city. It was a crumbling brick structure, its windows boarded up, its doors sealed with chains. A faded sign above the entrance read, "Blackwood Library." Elliot's stomach churned. She had never heard of this place, but it felt familiar, as if she had been here before in a dream. The key in her hand seemed to grow warmer, as if it were urging her forward. She approached the building, her legs feeling like lead, and found a small, rusted door tucked away in the shadows. The key fit perfectly into the lock, and with a loud click, the door swung open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The walls were lined with shelves, but they were empty, the books long gone. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, shattered glass, and piles of old newspapers. Elliot stepped inside, her heart pounding, and the door slammed shut behind her. She was trapped. The book had led her here, and now she was at its mercy. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and began to explore the library. The further she went, the more she felt as though she were walking into a dream. The shelves seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, the aisles twisting and turning like a labyrinth. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to shift and move on their own. And then she saw it. At the end of one of the aisles, there was a door. It was small and unassuming, just like the one from her dream. Her heart raced as she approached it, the key still clutched in her hand. She knew what was on the other side. The room of mirrors, the man with the hollow eyes. But she also knew she had no choice. The book had brought her here, and she had to see it through. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was exactly as she had seen it in her dream. Mirrors lined the walls, the ceiling, even the floor, reflecting her image endlessly. But something was different this time. The reflections weren't just distorted, they were alive. They moved on their own, their eyes following her as she walked further into the room. And then she saw him. The man from the park was standing in the center of the room, his hollow eyes staring straight at her. He smiled that cold, lifeless smile and held out his hand. "You're right on time," he said, his voice echoing in the small space. "The book has been waiting for you." Elliot's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there, but she couldn't move. The man stepped closer, his hand still outstretched. "Take it," he said. "It's the only way to end this." Elliot looked down and saw that he was holding a pen. It was old and ornate, its surface covered in intricate carvings. She knew what it was, the pen that would write the final chapter. The book had brought her here to finish the story, but she didn't know if she could do it. The man stepped closer, his hollow eyes boring into hers. "Take it," he repeated, his voice cold and commanding. Elliot's hands trembled as she reached for the pen. The moment her fingers touched it, a jolt of electricity shot through her body, and the room began to spin. The mirrors shattered, the reflections disappearing into nothingness, and she was plunged into darkness. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her apartment, sitting at the kitchen table. The book was open in front of her, the pen in her hand. The final page was blank, waiting for her to write the ending. Elliot's heart raced as she stared at the empty page. The book had brought her this far, but now it was up to her to finish the story. She didn't know what to write, but she knew she had to do something. If she didn't, the book would erase her from existence. She took a deep breath and began to write. The final chapter. Elliot's hand hovered over the blank page, the pen trembling in her grip. The weight of the moment pressed down on her like a physical force. This was it, the final chapter. The book had brought her to this point, weaving her life into its pages, but now it was her turn to take control. If she didn't write the ending, she would be erased. But what could she possibly write that would satisfy the book's demands? She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. She thought about everything that had happened, the discovery of the book, the man in the park, the labyrinthine library, the room of mirrors. It all felt like a nightmare, but she knew it was real. The book had rewritten her reality, and now it was up to her to rewrite it again. She opened her eyes and began to write. Elliot Harper sat at her kitchen table, the book open before her. She had come so far, endured so much, and now it was time to end the story. But she knew it wasn't just about ending it. It was about reclaiming her life. The book had taken so much from her, but it had also given her something: the power to shape her own destiny. As she wrote, the words seemed to flow effortlessly, as if the book itself were guiding her hand. But this time it felt different. This time she was in control. Elliot knew she couldn't destroy the book. It was too powerful, too deeply intertwined with her existence. But she could change its nature. She could turn it from a force of control into a force of creation. She would write her own story, not as a victim, but as the author of her life. Her hand moved faster now, the words spilling onto the page. With a deep breath, Elliot wrote the final words. And so, Elliot Harper closed the book, not with fear, but with hope. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. The book would always be a part of her, but it would no longer define her. She was free. As she wrote the last sentence, a strange warmth spread through her body, starting at her fingertips and radiating outward. The book began to glow, its pages shimmering with a soft, golden light. Elliot watched in awe as the light grew brighter, filling the room, and then, with a final flash, it was gone. The book lay on the table, its pages now blank once more. The pen in her hand was just a pen, ordinary and unremarkable. Elliot sat back, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. She didn't know what had just happened, but she felt different, lighter, freer, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She reached out and touched the book, half expecting it to come alive again, but it was just a book. She closed it gently and set it aside. For the first time in weeks, she felt like herself again. Over the next few days, Elliot began to rebuild her life. She returned to work, reconnected with friends and family, and even started writing again. not out of fear or obligation, but because she wanted to. The book had changed her, but it hadn't broken her. If anything, it had made her stronger. One evening, as she sat at her desk working on a new story, she noticed something strange. The green leather book was gone. She searched her apartment, but it was nowhere to be found. It was as if it had never existed. Elliot smiled to herself. Maybe it hadn't. Maybe the book had been nothing more than a figment of her imagination, a manifestation of her fears and doubts. Or maybe it had been real and she had simply outgrown it. Either way, she was free. She turned back to her desk and began to write, her pen moving across the page with confidence and purpose. This time, the story was hers alone.